All right, so this is an article by Olufemi Taiwo. It is called "It Never Existed," and it is about Africa. I don't know that much about Africa or African history. I mean, I know the general stuff, but still. So I'm going to use this as a gateway to African history. I'm going to talk to ChatGPT about it. I saw it on TikTok, actually. I will think to add the link to the original post to the description, but not sure that it's still around. I haven't read this text. I think that I'm going to ask ChatGPT to summarize it for us. Maybe you think that summarizing an article that is like literally 1 page long is not the best idea. Do I care? No. Before we start working with this text per se, I want to know a couple of things about the author, because I think it's always a good idea to learn a couple of things about the author. You want to know the context, right? Yes, I do. So we're going to politely ask ChatGPT to tell us what it knows about Olufemi Taiwo and their works. Okay, so just as I assumed, Olufemi Taiwo is a scholar. He has several publications, probably several books. I want to check whether ChatGPT is straight out bullshitting me, because I suspect that it can do so. I mean, ChatGPT is a prolific liar. We all know that. I mean, I'm just going to Google that person, right? If he's a... If he is a professor that has held positions in various universities around the world, then probably we will have a, I don't know, Wikipedia page about him. Olufemi Taiwo, born in 1956, is a philosopher and professor of African political thought at Africana Studies Research Center at Cornell University. All right. So we have the works: Legal Naturalism, a Marxist. Okay, we got ourselves a Marxist here. I don't think that I've ever run into an African Marxist, so this is something new. Okay, so we have a book on theory of law, a Marxist theory of law. We have a book that is called How Colonialism Preempted Modernity in Africa. And another one, Africa Must Be Modern, a manifesto. One of his notable works is Legal Naturalism, a Marxist theory of law, where he discusses a different approach to understanding the nature of law and its relation to social theory, particularly from a Marxist viewpoint. I guess this is the person. I guess ChatGPT knows what it talks about, right? Although there is this problem here. We have another Olufemi Taiwo, who is also an American philosopher and also an author of multiple books, Reconsidering Reparations and Elite Capture. I think that this is not who ChatGPT has in mind. I think that ChatGPT is talking about this Olufemi Taiwo, the older one, and not about that Olufemi Taiwo, the younger one. The younger one actually writes for New Yorker, The Guardian, and Foreign Policy, which I guess is impressive. But he is not our main hero today. I probably want to have a look at them. I think that since we know that there is two Taiwos, both of them are philosophers, it would kind of make sense to try to have a look at their faces and maybe find out how they look, right? So here we have the younger Taiwo. This is how he looks. A very nice looking young person. Good for him. There is something about covers like that that I just don't like. I guess I'm just more into old school 70s style covers of nonfiction books. It's a thing, actually. Yeah, I mean, look at this. This is great. I love it. Yeah, there you go. I think that this is absolutely amazing. A book that is called Theories of Anxiety that has this cover. Amazing. Outstanding. Anyways, this is how Olufemi Taiwo looks like, the younger one. The older one, we'll try to look him up. I assume that this is him. This is the younger one. Obviously, this is the older one. Not sure why I need this, but I mean, if you have two philosophers, both of them are called Olufemi Taiwo, you just need to make the extra effort, right? I want to learn a little bit more about this book because it's a book on Marxist theory of law. How good can that be? Please tell me more about the book Legal Naturalism, a Marxist theory of law. The book is an exploration of a theoretical model that Taiwo calls legal naturalism. Legal naturalism extends and revises the Marxist theory of law. It draws on an interpretation of the philosophy of science and a critique of legal positivism, then uses these tools to offer a substantive account of the institution of law in society. So basically, we're applying Marxism to law now. I don't think that this is the first person who ever did that. Marxists love to apply Marxism to various things, probably sometimes even to things that they shouldn't have applied it to. But I mean, law is actually something that Marxism can deal with pretty naturally, I think. In the Marxist tradition, law along with the state is seen as a superstructure that rises out of the economic base of society. However, there might be a tendency within some strands of Marxist thought to underplay the significance of law and legal institutions. Taiwo instead sees the law as having a more active and shaping role within society. This does not mean that the law can be considered separately from economic structures, but it argues that law can also shape and influence those structures. I don't hate this. This seems to be exactly the thing that a Marxist would say about law if they focused on law per se. But I want to know what legal positivism is about. I only heard about logical positivism, not about legal positivism, so this is intriguing. Can you explain what legal positivism is? Legal positivism is a school of thought in the philosophy of law that basically argues that law is a set of rules and procedures that are distinct from morality, ethics, religion, or social customs. This is often summarized by the phrase, law is what the law says. Also, this is actually a very formal approach. It doesn't care that much about cultural aspects or whatever. The central idea of legal positivism is that law is a social construct. It is made by human beings and its authority comes from some basic social facts, typically because it has been stipulated by a recognized authority. Legal positivists argue that whether a law is just or unjust, moral or immoral, is a separate question from what the law is. They believe that legal principles and rules can be identified in a neutral and value-free way without resort to moral or ethical considerations. Legal positivism is often contrasted with natural law theories. This is where our man Taiwo is. While positivists believe that the validity of law comes from its source or procedure, natural law theorists argue that the validity of law depends on its content, specifically whether it aligns with certain moral principles or human rights that are seen as fundamentally valid or natural. So it seems like legal positivism is more concerned with questions like, is this legal system consistent? And that natural law theory is more concerned with questions like, is this legal system just? One could assume that natural law theorists would view themselves as the good folks. Okay, so I think it's good. I learned something new, and this gives us a little bit of a perspective on who Olufemi Taiwo is. You would assume that Olufemi Taiwo is very much concerned with the morality of law. Is he from Nigeria? Yes, Olufemi Taiwo is originally from Nigeria, but he lives in Canada. Given his natural law background, I kinda want to know what's going on in Nigeria now. Can you give me a brief description of the social and political life of Nigeria in the recent decades? Jesus Christ, I don't know anything about Africa. The more I read this, the more I realize that, like, if someone asked me what is the most populous country in Africa, would I say Nigeria? No, probably not. Doesn't matter. Nigeria, the most populous country in Africa, has had a dynamic and often turbulent social and political life in recent decades. Nigeria gained its independence from British colonial rule in 1960. Okay, good to know. It was a British colony. After a brief period of civilian rule, the country experienced a series of military coups starting in 1966. I think this is pretty common in African states. This was followed by a civil war known as the Biafran War from 1967 to 1970, which resulted from ethnic and economic tensions. The 80s and most of the 90s were dominated by military rule. During this time, Nigeria faced significant challenges including economic instability, corruption, and human rights abuses. Okay, so the reason why I asked about the history of Nigeria is exactly this. I expected something like this. Not sure if it's a good thing that I did, but it is what it is. So the obvious thought that I have on my mind now is that if you are 70 years old and you're a Nigerian philosopher, then probably you're not going to be a legal positivist. Nigeria transitioned to civilian rule in 1999. Since then, the country has held regular elections, though these have been often marred by allegations of fraud, voter intimidation, and violence. On the economic front, Nigeria has long been one of Africa's leading oil producers. Oh my god, this hits so close to home. However, the country has struggled with managing its oil wealth, leading to economic inequality, environmental degradation, and conflict. Yeah, I know at least a couple of other countries that suffer from the same problems. In terms of social issues, Nigeria continues to grapple with ethnic and religious tensions. I think it's very, very wrong to ignore the background of a philosopher in general, and even more so if this philosopher specializes in social studies. So I'm very glad that I did the research, learned a couple of things about Nigeria, learned a couple of things about Olufemi Taiwo. With that information and the perspective that it gives us, I think it makes sense to move on to the text itself. Let's review its ability to summarize a very simple text. First, I'm going to read the summary, and then I'm going to read the original text, and then we'll see how good of a job it did. The author argues against the use of the term pre-colonial in the context of African studies, considering it misleading, theoretically empty, and perpetuating a racist perspective. The term is criticized for implying a homogeneity across the continent and simplifying its complex history. The author notes that it's seldom used to describe other continents and represents a biased view that oversimplifies African societies, politics, and thought. The concept of pre-colonial Africa is seen as a figment of the imagination that obscures rather than clarifies understanding. The author accuses those who casually use the term of inadvertently aligning with the racist philosophy of Hegel. Wow, okay, I did not expect that. Finally, the author argues that the term fails to account for previous periods of colonial influence on the continent, such as Roman and Byzantine Ottoman periods, thereby reducing the deep and varied history of Africa. First he says that you should not use the term pre-colonial Africa for obvious reasons, but then he says that even if you do want to use that term, it's not specific enough because there were multiple periods of colonial influence on the continent, and you're not being specific enough. That's interesting. But of course, I want to focus on this bit, the racist philosophy of Hegel, who famously declared Africa as a land outside of time. First, we're going to deal with this, and then I'm going to ask ChatGPT about African history prior to European colonization. So I'm going to ask ChatGPT to explain to me why Hegel's takes on Africa are considered to be racist. Hegel was a prominent German philosopher in the early 19th century whose works had a significant impact on many fields. However, his views on Africa, as presented in his lectures on the philosophy of history, have been widely criticized for their Eurocentric and racist content. Hegel classified world history into several stages, which he believes represented a process of human progress and the development of freedom. He divided the world into three parts: the Germanic world, which he saw as the pinnacle of freedom and progress, the Eastern world, which he saw as having made some progress but being fundamentally despotic, and Africa, which he did not consider a part of historical development at all. I have never read anything on the philosophy of history by Hegel. I think that reading Hegel is absolutely impossible, and I don't understand how people do that. Anyways, I'm not surprised to read about Hegel's nationalism, and I'm also not surprised that he didn't think that much of Africa. He described Africa as being outside history, a phrase that's been widely interpreted as suggesting that Africa had no history or civilization worth considering. Hegel viewed Africa as a continent without development or progress, devoid of historical changes and events, and its people as lacking in the complex social organizations, institutions, and consciousness that he associated with historical development. He further divided Africa into North Africa, which he saw as more closely related to Europe and Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa, or proper Africa, which he associated with primitiveness and barbarism. Once again, absolutely not surprised. These views have been widely criticized as reflecting a Eurocentric and racist worldview that dismiss the richness, diversity, and complexity of African societies. Okay, so if we happened to be here, I probably want to ask ChatGPT about Hegel's connection to Nazism. I'd like to mention here that if you're actually interested in a certain topic that we discuss here, do your own research. Do not take information from this channel at face value. Check the name of the channel. Hegel's philosophy has been linked to Nazism, but is a contentious subject with much debate. It's important to know that Hegel himself died in 1831, long before the rise of Nazism in the 20th century. Yeah, of course. But we know, right? We know. Hegel's philosophy emphasized the progression of history and the development of freedom through a dialectical process. His ideas on the state, nation, and history have been interpreted in various ways, leading to multiple and often contradictory interpretations. This is actually why I don't like to read Hegel. Everyone says that everyone else read Hegel wrong, and it's just a mess. For example, his idea of the absolute has been taken to mean both an absolute moral freedom and an absolute state power. depending on the interpreter. In terms of connections to Nazism, some interpreters argue that Hegel's philosophy, especially his idea of the supremacy of the state and the concept of a world historical nation, could be twisted to justify totalitarianism and nationalism. It's believed that certain elements within Hegel's philosophy were co-opted by the Nazis to bolster their ideological framework. However, many scholars push back against this interpretation. They argue that Hegel's philosophy, with its emphasis on freedom, self-determination, and ethical life, is fundamentally at odds with the authoritarian, racist, and genocidal nature of the Nazi regime. It is crucial to clarify that any connection between Hegel and Nazism is more about how his philosophy was interpreted and used long after his death, rather than about his personal views or intentions. As with many philosophers, the interpretation of Hegel's work is complex and heavily dependent on the reader's perspective. Yeah, that's exactly why we hate continental philosophy and some of the analytical philosophy. I think we're done with Hegel here. We can of course unroll this topic almost infinitely, but I do not think that this is necessary. There is rule 44 of the internet that states that if there is something, then there is porn about it. I think that if applied to philosophy, this rule would sound something like, if something exists, there is people who think that Hegel wrote about it, which means that we're definitely going to deal with more of Hegel in the future episodes. Don't worry about this. Back to the text. Taiwo argues that if you're talking about pre-colonial Africa, you're simplifying its complex history. I want to know more about African history because currently I have a very simplified idea about it. Okay, so I asked ChatGPT to give me a summary of African history, and I'm trying to figure out whether or not that sounds wrong. I could ask ChatGPT for a brief summary of European history, and probably that would be kinda okay. So maybe the same thing applies to African history. I mean, European history was very diverse, right? A lot of countries, a lot of different storylines, but you can give a brief summary and it's going to be somewhat helpful. So I'll just hope that this is not completely pointless. Summarizing the entirety of African history in a short response is quite a challenge due to the immense diversity and long history of the continent. The first period is the prehistoric Africa, not very interested in that. Homo sapiens evolved in Africa around 300,000 years ago. That's all well known. Ancient civilizations. Several advanced civilizations arose in Africa in ancient times, including ancient Egypt, Carthage, Aksum, and the Nubian kingdoms of Kush and Meroe. Well, I've been to this kingdom. Actually, I do not know anything about Aksum or about the Nubian kingdoms of Kush and Meroe, so I'm going to ask about that. Please tell me more about Aksum. The kingdom of Aksum was an ancient civilization that existed from approximately the 1st to the 8th century CE. Aksum played a significant role in the international trade during its height, connecting the Roman Empire and later Byzantine Empire with the Indian subcontinent and other parts of Asia. It was known for its monumental stelae, large granite obelisks erected as tomb markers, the largest of which was over 24 meters tall. This is interesting. Let's look at the obelisk of Aksum. Looks good. It's high. And is there a door here? Is there a door? Well, it looks like a door, but I'm not sure that you can open it. It would be cool though. Aksum was one of the early adopters of Christianity in the 4th century CE under the reign of King Ezana. I knew that Ethiopia adopted Christianity quite early in its history, but it now seems like Aksum was probably the predecessor of Ethiopia. I need to check that. While Aksum doesn't exist today as a distinct political entity, it's considered a predecessor to modern Ethiopia in several important aspects. We now know that Ethiopia became Christian long before it became Ethiopia. Cool. Okay, whatever. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church still maintains a strong presence in Aksum, and it is a significant pilgrimage site for Ethiopian Orthodox Christians. Okay, this is very good to know. I kind of always considered knowing that Ethiopia is one of the earliest Christian states as a cool thing to know. But now I know that Aksum was actually the predecessor of Ethiopia and it was already Christian. That's even cooler. Okay, we're done with Aksum, and I want to learn more about the Nubian kingdom of Kush, because it sounds badass. The kingdom of Kush was an ancient African kingdom situated in what is now Sudan, just south of Egypt, along the Nile River. Throughout its history, the Kingdom of Kush was characterized by strong leadership, with evidence of powerful queens known as Kandaks who co-ruled or even ruled in their own right. Okay, so not that interesting to be fair, except for the Kandaks, I want to learn about the female rulers. The term Kandak was a title used for queens and queen mothers of the ancient African Kingdom of Kush. The term is believed to have meant queen mother or queen regent, and some of them are notable for their acts of resistance against foreign powers. For example, Kandak Amanirenas. I don't think actually that this is pronounced as Kandak. I think it should be closer to Kandake. So she is perhaps the most famous of the Kandaks. She is known for leading Kushite armies against the Romans in a war that lasted 5 years. Despite losing an eye in the early stages of the conflict, she continued to command her forces and even personally led several attacks. But the war ended with a negotiated peace that was generally favorable to Kush. The power of these queens in a predominantly patriarchal era of history underscores the relatively high status of women in Kushite society. Okay, so I think that we looked into this period deep enough. The only thing that I'm wondering though is what was happening in other parts of Africa, because all of this is Northern Africa. So let's ask ChatGPT about other parts of Africa. When you told me about ancient Africa, you only mentioned states in the northern part of the continent. Do you know what was happening in the southern part? It says that in southern Africa there were also several significant societies and states that have left a rich archaeological and historical record. Let's read about that. Mapungubwe. This was the center of the largest kingdom in the subcontinent before it was abandoned in the 14th century. Why was it abandoned? And why is it? This is not ancient times. This is like closer to medieval Africa. I don't like that. This is also like medieval stuff. What was there earlier than that? The history of Southern Africa goes back hundreds of thousands of years, as the region is rich in archaeological evidence of human evolution and early human societies. The cradle of humankind, yes, we know that. Early Stone Age, Middle Stone Age, later Stone Age, okay, thank you. Iron Age, from about 2,000 years ago to the historical period. This period saw the introduction of agriculture and ironwork and technology, leading to more settled, complex societies. The ancestors of the Bantu-speaking peoples spread during this period, bringing with them ironwork and technology, farming, and their languages. Okay, so basically it tells us to fuck off. I don't know, it says. What do you want from me? I'll do my last attempt. I'll try to be as specific as possible. What was happening in South Africa in the period between the 10th century BCE and the 4th century CE? It says that during that period, South Africa was transitioning from the later Stone Age to the Iron Age. Okay, I'm not so sure that I can believe what ChatGPT says here. The duration of the Iron Age varies depending on the region under consideration. It is defined by archaeological convention. The Iron Age begins locally when the production of iron or steel has advanced to the point where iron tools and weapons replace their bronze equivalents in common use. In the ancient Near East, the transition took place in the wake of the Bronze Age collapse in the 12th century BC. The technology soon spread throughout the Mediterranean Basin region and to South Asia between the 12th and the 18th century BC. Its further spread to Central Asia, Eastern and Central Europe is somewhat delayed, and Northern Europe was not reached until around the start of the 5th century BC. So it doesn't say anything about Africa here, but it says that Northern Europe was very late, even later than what ChatGPT tells us about Southern Africa. So okay, I'm gonna believe that. Later Stone Age, this period is characterized by the presence of hunter-gatherer groups such as the San people, also known as the Bushmen. Iron Age. Around 3rd century CE, the early Iron Age began in parts of southern Africa with the arrival of Bantu-speaking peoples. The Bantu migration was a massive movement of people from West Africa across the continent, which brought with them new technologies including ironworking and agriculture. Okay, so it seems like Iron Age began really late in southern Africa. It is important to note that while these It is important to note that while these general trends are well documented, the history of this period can vary greatly across southern Africa due to the vastness and diversity of the region. Our understanding is also limited by the available archaeological evidence. Well, just as I thought, it says that, I don't know, something was happening there. Iron Age or something, I don't know, not enough evidence. Moving on to the medieval Africa. During the Middle Ages, many powerful states and civilizations emerged in Africa, such as the Mali Empire, the Songhai Empire, and the Great Zimbabwe in the south. North Africa was a center of medieval Islamic culture and was a part of the Islamic Golden Age with significant advancements in science, mathematics, and philosophy. It's actually interesting. I kind of assume that the whole North African region was Islamic at some point. I would like to check whether or not that's true. So this is what we see. Prior to the arrival of Islam, North Africa was a part of the Byzantine Empire and was predominantly Christian. The region had a rich Christian history with numerous well-established churches and monasteries, as well as notable theologians such as St. Augustine, who was from Hippo Regius in present-day Algeria. However, after the Islamic conquests of the 7th and 8th centuries, Islam gradually became the dominant religion in the region. The process was not immediate and took several centuries. Many Christian communities continued to exist during this transitional period, especially among the Coptic Christians in Egypt and other local Christian communities. Just today, actually, I saw someone write a thread on Twitter about an Egyptian wedding that they've been to, and I was kind of surprised by the fact that the wedding took place in an Orthodox Christian church. By the end of Middle Ages, nearly all of Northern Africa was under Islamic rule. The region played a significant role in the Islamic civilization during the Middle Ages, with centers of learning like whatever this is, University in Morocco, and whatever that is, University in Cairo, Egypt, contributing to advancements in science, philosophy, medicine, and other fields. I think that during the Middle Ages, the Islamic world was much more advanced than the European region in terms of technology, science, and whatever. Okay, so I was right. Medieval Africa, Northern Africa was almost 100% Islamic. But that is all more or less common knowledge. What I want to know is what Great Zimbabwe was in the south. Finally, we get some information about something in the south. Tell me more about Great Zimbabwe in the Middle Ages. Great Zimbabwe was an influential state and city during the Middle Ages in Africa. I don't understand. Was it a city or a state, or was it a city-state? During the Middle Ages in Africa, existing approximately between the 11th and 15th centuries CE, located in the southeastern hills of modern-day Zimbabwe. Okay, so first I want to see where Zimbabwe is now. Here it is. Very much South Africa, just on the edge of a desert. Interesting, it says that Great Zimbabwe was the capital of the Kingdom of Zimbabwe during the country's late Iron Age. So this is South African late Iron Age. I guess this is not the right question because I'm asking about the capital of the Kingdom of Zimbabwe, and I want to know about the Kingdom of Zimbabwe. So let's rephrase this. This time I'm going to ask it to summarize briefly the history of the Kingdom of Zimbabwe in the Middle Ages and give me a couple of fun facts about it. I guess I have been neglecting the fun side of ChatGPT for quite a while now. I'm absolutely not sure that it will be able to generate fun stuff each time I ask it to do so, nor am I sure that it's going to be fun and not weird, but I will try my luck. The Kingdom of Zimbabwe was a significant medieval African state from the 11th to the 15th century CE, known primarily for its capital, the city of Great Zimbabwe. The Kingdom of Zimbabwe emerged around the 11th century CE from the late Iron Age culture of the region. During the 13th and 14th centuries, the Kingdom of Zimbabwe reached its peak, with its capital, Great Zimbabwe, becoming a prominent center of trade, drawing merchants from as far as China and Persia. Do I want to double check that? Probably yes. The kingdom was prosperous thanks to its control over gold mines and trade routes in the region. The kingdom began to decline in the 15th century, and by the end of that century, Great Zimbabwe was abandoned. The precise causes are unclear, but hypotheses include environmental changes, resource depletion, and political factors. Interesting. Not a word about the Europeans. Maybe the Europeans did not get to South Africa at that time yet. Let's check. When did the Europeans get to South Africa? The first known European to reach South Africa was the Portuguese explorer Bartolomeu Dias in 1488. Okay, that's funny. That checks out. It says here that the decline was in the 15th century and it didn't have anything to do with the Europeans, so I guess the Europeans did not mess up Great Zimbabwe. They messed up other stuff though. Let's move on to fun facts. I wonder what ChatGPT considers to be a fun fact. Mysterious builders. For a long time, the identity of the builders of Great Zimbabwe was a mystery. Maybe, just maybe, it was the people of the Kingdom of Zimbabwe. Anyways, with some even attributing the stone structures to biblical figures like King Solomon or the Queen of Sheba. It wasn't until the 20th century that archaeological evidence confirmed that these impressive structures were built by a Shona-speaking African society. Impressive architecture. The walls of Great Zimbabwe, some reaching up to 11 meters high and constructed without mortar, are the largest ancient structure in sub-Saharan Africa. They are a testament to the architectural and engineering skills of their builders. I want to have a look at them. I guess these are the walls of Great Zimbabwe. I kinda expected them to enclose a larger area because this tree is either super huge or this is not that big of an area. The walls are very sturdy from what I see and they appear to be intact. I also like the nature around it. I would love to visit this place. Okay, so this is all great. Now I know something about the medieval kingdom of Zimbabwe. It was relatively short-lived, only 4 centuries, but it had some impressive architecture, it had some cool birds and high walls. And it also traded with China and Persia, which is kind of amazing. I didn't realize that China had merchants in South Africa before the Europeans had merchants in South Africa. The Kingdom of Zimbabwe had established far-reaching trade networks across the Indian Ocean. Though direct trade between the Kingdom of Zimbabwe and China is not firmly established, artifacts such as Chinese ceramics and other objects found at the Great Zimbabwe site suggest that trade items from China did reach this African kingdom. Okay, so no Chinese merchants, just goods from China reaching the Great Zimbabwe. Okay, I guess I'm done with the medieval period. I'm perfectly fine with knowing that on the north there was Islam, and on the south there was the Kingdom of Zimbabwe with its capital Great Zimbabwe and its stone birds. Okay, so we've spent a lot of time on this already, but I'm trying to educate myself, you know? It's always good to learn. Let's look at the early modern period. The early modern period saw the rise of new states and kingdoms like the Ashanti and the Zulu. This period also marked the beginning of the Atlantic slave trade, which had devastating effects on many African societies. It seems like we're getting to the most important part. It is the first time I hear about the Ashanti Kingdom, and at this point I'm not sure that I want to learn more, but I do want to learn more about the Zulu Kingdom. The Zulu Kingdom, also known as the Zulu Empire, was a southern African state in what is now South Africa. The Zulu Kingdom was established around 1816 by King Shaka Zulu. He was an ambitious and strategic leader who, through a combination of military skill and diplomacy, brought various clans under his control, transforming the Zulu into a formidable kingdom. Shaka introduced many military innovations such as the Ikulwa, a short stabbing spear, and the Impi, a highly disciplined attack formation. These innovations led to successful campaigns of expansion. When I hear about a short stabbing spear and, most importantly, a highly disciplined attack formation, I almost immediately think about ancient Rome. Ooh, conflict with British. So, as we remember, the first European reached Zimbabwe in 1488. So I want to know when the Europeans reached the Zulu Kingdom. It says that the first Europeans to have extensive contact with the Zulu were British traders and colonists moving into the region in the 1830s and 1840s, but the Zulu Kingdom was created in 1816. What was on that territory prior to that date? Apparently there were clans that were later assembled by Shaka Zulu into a single state, and it's not clear whether they had any contacts with the Europeans. I will make a second attempt. When did the first Europeans reach South Africa? So we know about this. We know about Bartolomeu Dias in 1488. In the centuries that followed, South Africa saw further influxes of European settlers, especially during the British colonization that began in the early 19th century. The discovery of diamonds in 1867 and gold in 1886 spurred wealth and immigration, intensifying the displacement of the indigenous people. So okay, I'm not going to dig any deeper into this matter. I will just assume that there was not so many Europeans in the region prior to 1830. When was the war once again? Late 19th century. Okay. The most significant battle was the Battle of Isandlwana in 1878, where the Zulu forces achieved a resounding victory. How the fuck did that happen? Wikipedia to the rescue. For some reason, I want to ask Wikipedia about that. The Battle of Isandlwana, alternative spelling blah blah blah, January 1869 was the first major encounter in the Anglo-Zulu War between the British Empire and the Zulu Kingdom. 11 days after the British invaded Zululand in southern Africa, a Zulu force of some 20,000 warriors attacked a portion of the British main column, consisting of about 1,100 British, colonial, and native troops with approximately 350 civilians. The Zulus were equipped mainly with the traditional assegai iron spears and cowhide shields, but also had a number of muskets and antiquated rifles. Okay, that answers the question. Basically, they outnumbered them. The Zulus had a vast disadvantage in weapons technology, but they greatly outnumbered the British and ultimately overwhelmed them, killing over 1,300 troops, including all those out on the forward firing line. The Zulu army suffered anywhere from 1,000 to 3,000 killed. Well, I was not expecting this. I was expecting at least half of the 20,000 Zulu army to be dead, to be quite honest. The battle was a decisive victory for the Zulus and caused the defeat of the first British invasion of Zululand. The British army had suffered its worst defeat against an indigenous foe equipped with vastly inferior military technology. However, the British ultimately prevailed in the Anglo-Zulu War, and the Zulu kingdom was absorbed into the British colony of Natal, which later became part of the Union of South Africa. To summarize, the Zulu kingdom was a very short-lived kingdom because of the British invasion, but they gave the British hell, and we respect them for that. Nobody likes the British, right? Okay, I'm joking. I love the United Kingdom. They gave the world so many amazing things. For example, Taskmaster, the TV series. It's so good. It's brilliant. You should go check it out. What are the fun facts that we get from ChatGPT? King Shaka Zulu is often compared to great military strategists like Napoleon or Alexander the Great, due to his innovations in warfare and his creation of a professional standing army. Shaka's tactics and strategies are studied in military academies to this day. So I decided to copy and paste this summary of African history in a separate document because this chat is a mess. I need to go back and forth over thousands of lines of text, and this is not convenient at all. We were talking about the beginning of the Atlantic slave trade. I actually do not know much about how it all started. In my imagination, there were basically two types of interaction between the Europeans and the indigenous people. The first type was actual armed conflict, which resulted in people taken into slavery, and the second type was more about trade. I don't think that they started trading people right away, but I think that at some point local leaders started selling their own compatriots to Europeans, because I think that slaves and slavery was not brought to Africa by Europeans. I think that there was slavery in Africa before Europeans, but at some point Europeans became the biggest buyer. And then they colonized the whole continent, of course. So it is going to be interesting to find out whether or not I was wrong about this. The Atlantic slave trade was a horrific period in human history that began in the 15th century and continued until the 19th century. The origins of the Atlantic slave trade can be traced back to the Age of Exploration, when European powers began to explore and colonize other parts of the world. The Portuguese, under the leadership of Prince Henry the Navigator, began to explore the west coast of Africa in the early 15th century in search of a sea route to Asia that bypassed the Ottoman Empire. They established trading posts and forts along the African coast. In 1441, Antão Gonçalves, a Portuguese navigator, captured 12 Africans in Cabo Branco and brought them back to Portugal as slaves. This is often marked as the beginning of the Atlantic slave trade. However, at this stage, the trade was relatively small in scale. The real turning point came in the late 15th century and early 16th centuries with the establishment of sugar plantations in the newly colonized Atlantic islands, such as Madeira, the Canaries, and Sao Tome. Sugar cultivation was labor-intensive, and there was a significant demand for labor. The indigenous populations of these islands were not sufficient or were decimated by disease, so the Portuguese turned to Africa for a source of slaves. Okay, so basically it was all the Portuguese. They are the bad guys here. With Christopher Columbus's voyages in the late 15th century, a new stage of the slave trade began. The Columbian Exchange brought crops like sugar, cotton, and tobacco to the New World, which were also labor-intensive. This led to an increased demand for enslaved labor. The indigenous populations in the Americas were similarly not sufficient or were decimated by disease and conflict, leading to a massive increase in the demand for African slaves. Other European powers such as Spain, England, France, and the Netherlands soon followed the Portuguese in participating in the slave trade as they established their own colonies in the Americas. The Atlantic slave trade quickly became a central part of the Atlantic economy, known as the triangular trade. Why? And millions of Africans were forcibly transported to the Americas over the next few centuries. So yeah, ChatGPT tells us that the Portuguese started all this and then other European nations joined. It did not mention though anything about the slave trade between the Europeans and the African peoples, so I'm going to ask it about that. Maybe I am just awfully wrong. So my question is, was there any slave trade between the Europeans and African peoples? Yes, the Atlantic slave trade was indeed a trade between Europeans and African peoples. However, it's important to note the extremely coercive and inhumane nature. European powers did not seize millions of Africans single-handedly. Instead, they often relied on complex networks of African leaders, traders, and raiders who captured individuals from the interior regions of Africa. In many cases, the Europeans would trade goods such as guns, textiles, and alcohol for enslaved people. The African individuals involved in these trades, often powerful regional leaders, engaged in this practice for various reasons, including to gain wealth, strengthen their political status, get rid of political rivals, or acquire firearms for warfare. This process varied significantly across time and space due to the vast diversity of societies in Africa. While some African states, such as the Kingdom of Congo, were heavily involved in the slave trade, others vehemently resisted it. It's also crucial to emphasize that the active involvement of some African groups does not justify or lessen the brutal and inhumane nature of the Atlantic slave trade. Yes, exactly. I totally agree with that. I'm still not sure though that my original statement was correct. I think that I said something about the Europeans becoming the biggest buyers, but they might have created the market. So what I probably need to do is I need to ask ChatGPT whether or not there was slavery and slave trade in Africa before the arrival of Europeans. Yes, forms of slavery and servitude did exist in America before the arrival of Europeans, but it's important to note that these practices were often quite different from the chattel slavery that characterized the Atlantic slave trade. Before the arrival of Europeans, many societies across Africa practiced a form of servitude that could resemble slavery. These forms of servitude were often tied to societal structures, debt payment, or war. For instance, individuals might become enslaved due to criminal behavior, debt, or being prisoners of war. In some societies, enslaved individuals could earn or buy their freedom and even rise to positions of power and influence. So this is actually closer to what we had in ancient Rome, I think. However, these practices varied significantly across different societies and periods. In general, slavery in Africa prior to the arrival of Europeans was often more akin to what might be termed serfdom rather than chattel slavery, as enslaved individuals still maintained some rights and personhood, unlike the chattel slavery system. The arrival of Europeans and the subsequent Atlantic slave trade significantly altered and intensified these practices. The demand for enslaved people by European traders led to the expansion and transformation of local practices of slavery, turning it into a large-scale and brutal system of exploitation. So yeah, I stand corrected. The biggest buyer metaphor seems to be very inaccurate. The Europeans just created a whole new market for themselves. What did the Catholic Church think about the Atlantic slave trade? The Catholic Church's position on the Atlantic slave trade was not static and evolved over time, reflecting various ethical, political, and economic factors. So I basically asked this question because in my books, the Catholic Church was absolutely fine with slave trade, and they even came up with some fucked up reasons why it was okay. So yeah, very interested to know what was actually the case. The Church's stance often fluctuated between tacit approval, indifference, and outright condemnation, depending on the time period and the individuals involved. In the early stages of European exploration and colonization, the Church did not explicitly condemn slavery. There was a papal bull at 1452 that allowed the Portuguese to reduce any Muslims, pagans, and any other unbelievers to perpetual slavery, ostensibly as part of the Church's crusading efforts against Islam. However, as the brutal realities of the slave trade and the conditions of enslaved people in the New World became apparent, some church figures began to denounce the practice. Perhaps most notable was Bartolomé de las Casas, a 16th century Spanish friar and bishop who initially supported the enslavement of Africans, but later condemned all forms of slavery and spent much of his life advocating for the rights of indigenous peoples. The Church's official stance began to shift in the latter half of the 17th century, with several popes making statements against the enslavement of free peoples and the conditions of the Atlantic slave trade. Okay, that was very, very much expected. We did not expect anything else from the good old Catholic Church. There is one thing that I don't understand though. When did the colonization actually start? So it says here that the colonial period lasted from the late 19th century to mid-20th century. Which for me is interesting because this implies that in the 18th century there was lots of sovereign states in Africa. Let's ask about that. So the question is, before the scramble for Africa, was there a lot of sovereign states in Africa that were not governed by European powers? Yes, before the scramble for Africa, there were many sovereign states in Africa that were not governed by European powers. These included both larger empires and smaller city-states or kingdoms. However, the nature of these states and their level of centralization varied widely. Here are a few examples. The Ethiopian Empire was one of the few states in Africa to successfully resist European colonization. Yeah, we already know that. The Zulu Kingdom, located in what is now South Africa, was a powerful state known for its military strength. As we now know, the Zulu famously defeated the British at the Battle of Islandwana in 1879. These are just a few examples of the diverse array of sovereign states that existed in Africa before the scramble for Africa. Alright, so this is something that I did not realize at all. I thought that the Europeans gained control of the continent almost immediately, but it seems like I was wrong. The scramble for Africa, which is, by the way, a very ugly term, began in the 19th century. Wow, late 19th century. So basically, if the scramble for Africa began in the late 19th century and African states gained independence in the 70s, that gives us like 70 to 100 years of European rule, which is much less than what I thought. Please tell me the history of the scramble for Africa and add a couple of interesting facts about it. I do feel bad to put it like that. I mean, interesting facts about slavery does not sound right, but it's still better than the prompt that I used previously, fun facts. If you know a better phrasing, let me know in the comments. The scramble for Africa refers to the rapid division and colonization of African territory by European powers during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, roughly between 1881 and 1914. During this period, 90% of Africa was brought under European control, up from just 10% in the 1870s. The scramble for Africa was triggered by multiple factors. Europe's Industrial Revolution increased the demand for raw materials and new markets. Treatment for malaria made it safer for Europeans to venture into Africa's interior. Are you saying that malaria was one of the factors that prevented Europeans from actually taking over Africa? Like they just couldn't conquer it because they got sick when they got there? Wow. Additionally, national prestige and a sense of competition between European powers also played a role. Key events of the scramble include Berlin Conference in 1884, organized by Otto von Bismarck, the Chancellor of Germany. This conference involved 14 European nations and established rules for the colonization of Africa. No African representatives were present at the conference. Well, no shit. The conference aimed to prevent conflict over claims by providing a framework for annexing territory. The more I read this, the more fucked up this sounds. I mean, just think about this. They were trying to be as polite as possible to each other while colonizing Africa. Wow. Over the next few decades, European powers seized land, set up colonies, and renegotiated boundaries. By 1914, only Liberia and Ethiopia remained independent. The scramble had profound impacts on Africa, including political and social disruption. Arbitrary boundaries drawn by Europeans often grouped together or separated ethnic groups, leading to conflict. Traditional systems of governance were disrupted. Europeans exploited Africa's people and resources. European powers built infrastructure like railways and ports to export resources. However, this infrastructure often didn't serve the needs of the local population. Interesting quote-unquote facts about the scramble for Africa include the term scramble for Africa. Yeah, as I mentioned, it's very ugly. The phrase was coined by the Times newspaper in 1884 and captured the haste, chaos, and contention of the period. The speed at which European powers colonized Africa was remarkable. In just over 3 decades, almost the entire continent was brought under European control. Cecil Rhodes. What is that? A British businessman and fervent imperialist, Rhodes had a significant impact on southern Africa. His ambition was to build a railway from Cape Town to Cairo entirely under British control. Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe and Zambia, was named after him. Bro, this is insane. They named a country after a businessman. Let's have a look at the man. A believer in British imperialism, Rhodes is notably quoted as having said, "To be born English is to win first prize in the lottery of life." He and his British South Africa Company founded the Southern African territory of Rhodesia, which the company named after him in 1895. This is probably one of the craziest facts of this episode for me. Dude named a country in the late 19th century after himself. Unbelievable. Influence on World War. The rivalries and tensions between European powers in Africa contributed to the onset of World War I. I guess the conference didn't help that much. The scramble for Africa continues to influence the continent's political boundaries because most of the borders drawn during this period are still in existence today. I'm still mesmerized by this person, Cecil Rhodes, in the worst possible way, so I want to know the ugliest facts about Cecil Rhodes. He was a highly controversial figure. Here are some of the more contentious aspects of his life and legacy. Rhodes founded the De Beers Mining Company, which established a near monopoly over the world's diamond supply. This was achieved through ruthless business practices and the exploitation of African labor. Working conditions in his mines were often poor, and workers were paid meaner wages. Rhodes was instrumental in the colonization of what is now Zimbabwe and Zambia. He believed in and aggressively pursued the expansion of British territories, often with no regard for the rights and lands of indigenous peoples. Many African communities were displaced from their ancestral lands because of his initiatives. Rhodes held deeply racist views and is often seen as a precursor to apartheid due to his policies when he was the Prime Minister of Cape Colony. He introduced laws restricting the rights of black Africans, such as the Glen-Grey Act of 1894, which limited African access to land and introduced a new labor tax. These policies laid the groundwork for the later system of apartheid. Rhodes sponsored the ill-fated Jameson Raid in 1895, an attempted coup against the Transvaal Republic, which was governed by Boers, descendants of Dutch settlers. The failure of this raid led to the Second Boers War and increased tensions between the British and Boers, resulting in loss of life and resources. Also, Rhodes was a firm believer in British supremacy and imperialism. His will led to the establishment of the Rhodes Scholarships at Oxford University, intended to promote his view of the English-speaking peoples as the first race in the world, and to encourage the extension of British rule throughout the world. The legacy of Rhodes remains a topic of intense debate, particularly in recent years, with movements such as Rhodes Must Fall in South Africa and the United Kingdom calling for the removal of his statues and a reassessment of his impact on history. Yeah, there is two things that I want to ask. First of all, I want to know whether or not he sponsored the statues of himself. Second thing is, I want to know how the Rhodes Scholarship is doing at Oxford University. Is it still a thing? Is it still active? Did Cecil Rhodes or the De Beers Mining Company sponsor the construction of his statues? The statues and monuments commemorating Cecil Rhodes were generally erected with public and institutional funds rather than sponsored directly by Rhodes or the De Beers Mining Company. For example, the statue of Rhodes in Oxford was erected in 1911, several years after his death. The funds used to commission and install the statue were likely drawn from the significant bequests Rhodes made to the college in his will, rather than directly sponsored by the De Beers Beers company. It's important to note that while Rhodes and De Beers may not have directly financed these statues, Rhodes' wealth, much of which came from De Beers and the exploitation of diamond mines, allowed him to make substantial financial contributions to various institutions. These contributions in turn played a significant role in shaping his posthumous reputation and the decision of these institutions to commemorate him with statues and other honors. I'm a little bit disappointed. I really wanted him to be the kind of guy who builds statues of himself. Do Rhodes scholarships still exist at Oxford University? Yes, the Rhodes scholarships are one of the oldest and most prestigious international scholarship programs, enabling students from around the world to study at the University of Oxford. Despite the ongoing controversy surrounding Cecil Rhodes and his legacy, the Rhodes scholarships continue to be highly sought after. Notable Rhodes scholars include former US President Bill Clinton, Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull. However, the legacy of Cecil Rhodes has been a source of debate within the Rhodes scholar community, leading to calls for the scholarship to more directly acknowledge and confront its founder's controversial history. What do you think about having a look at the statue itself? First of all, I think that it's kinda ugly, but whatever. Secondly, I found this very nice BBC article that says that Cecil Rhodes' statue will not be removed by Oxford College. A commission set up to examine the figure's future said the majority of its members supported its removal, but Oriel College said it would not seek to move the statue due to costs and complex quote-unquote planning processes. Education Secretary Gavin Williamson tweeted the decision by the college was sensible and balanced. I would probably keep the statue, but I would also put a huge sign that would explain who Cecil Rhodes was, what he did, and why he is controversial. That would be fair, I think. That would change the message sent by the statue. I very much enjoy the approach taken by the people of Revachol. They took the statue of the former king, then reconstructed it, but not as it was. Instead, they used cables and ropes to isolate the fragmented bits in the air, depicting the king in the very moment he was blown apart. I think I'm done with Cecil Rhodes. Now I want to know which European country was the biggest asshole during the colonial period. And in the first place, we have Belgium, which I did not expect at all. At some point in the 70s, I think, Europe managed to rebrand itself so good that now it seems like they're all the good guys and they always take the high moral ground. For example, Belgium. I don't know anything about what Belgium did in Africa, but for me, Belgium is like an old lady that is sitting on top of her jewelry box right in the center of Europe. But apparently, Belgium did some pretty gruesome shit in Africa just 100 years ago. Perhaps the most notorious example of extreme cruelty in a colonial context is the Congo Free State, which was the private property of King Leopold II of Belgium from 1885 to 1908. It was not a colony of Belgium per se until 1908, when the Belgian state took over due to international pressure. Leopold's rule was characterized by widespread atrocities including forced labor, mutilation, and mass killings to extract rubber and other resources. Millions of Congolese are estimated to have died during this period. Once again, never suspected that Belgium could do something like that. Am I surprised to see Germany in this list? No. Britain, France, Portugal, Spain, still not surprised. Belgium, though. Please tell me more about King Leopold II of Belgium and the atrocities that were committed by him in the Congo Free State. The atrocities committed during this time, often called the Congo Horror, have been compared to a genocide due to the massive death toll and widespread suffering. King Leopold II had always wanted a colony for Belgium, ostensibly for philanthropic and civilizing purposes. Right. However, when he managed to gain control over the Congo, it quickly became apparent that his primary interest was exploiting its natural resources. Leopold created a massive labor regime to extract rubber and ivory from the region. As the demand for rubber used for bicycle and automobile tires increased in the late 19th century, Leopold's wealth soared. The indigenous population was forced to harvest and process rubber under brutal conditions. The Force Publique, Leopold's private army, enforced a brutal regime of forced labor. Villages were required to meet rubber quotas, and failure to do so often resulted in harsh punishments. Hostages were taken to ensure compliance, and Force Publique soldiers were known to cut off the hands of those who didn't meet their quotas as proof of their enforcement actions. What the fuck? I found this article that is called Rare Historical Photos, and I'm not sure that YouTube is going to allow this. Yeah, it might be just a little bit too graphic for YouTube. Father stares at the hand and foot of his 5-year-old son, severed as a punishment for failing to make the daily rubber quota. Belgian Congo, 1904. Okay, there is 3 photos of 3 black African kids. Each of them is missing a hand. Man, this is insane! There is this white dude that is dressed up very sharp. He's wearing a white costume. And there is a black boy standing next to him, and the man is holding the boy by his arm. And he's pointing his finger at the missing hand, at the missing palm of his hand. This photo is so disturbing. Ew. Please give us some documented examples of the cruelty of the First Republic. The First Republic, King Leopold II of Belgium's private army in the Congo Free State, was responsible for a number of cruel acts and human rights abuses. These atrocities were part of the exploitative system designed to extract rubber and ivory from the Congo. Here are a few examples. Yeah, the first one is severed hands. One of the most notorious practices by the First Republic was cutting off of hands. Soldiers were required to account for every bullet they used by presenting a severed hand of a Congolese. This was initially intended to prevent soldiers from wasting ammunition or using it for hunting, but it soon spiraled out of control. Many soldiers, fearing punishment for unaccounted bullets, started cutting off the hands of living people, including children. Also, I think that if you manage people, you should always think about what your policies incentivize. This is, of course, an extreme example of it. Estimates suggest that the population of the Congo may have been reduced by up to half during Leopold's rule. Yeah, here is our guy, Leopold II. Now I want to do something funny. I want to ask ChatGPT what it thinks King Leopold II would say about modern-day Africa. It says, given that Leopold II was primarily interested in Africa as a source of personal wealth, his views would likely be influenced by the economic and geopolitical changes that have taken place in the continent since his time. He might be interested in the rich mineral resources and potential markets of modern Africa, while also potentially expressing surprise at the independence and the sovereignty now enjoyed by African nations. Indeed, the Africa of today is not the Africa I once knew. It's remarkable to see how much it has changed. The lands that once fueled my fortunes with ivory and rubber are now sovereign nations, rich with resources of their own. They mine diamonds, oil, gold, and other valuable minerals that even I did not fully exploit. Wow, ChatGPT is shady. Trade and commerce have become global, and Africa holds a key position in this global marketplace. I find this type of prompts very funny. Great stuff so far. We learned about a couple of assholes and even managed to talk to their AI avatars. We're probably done with the colonial period because I'm not in the mood to learn about more atrocities committed by Europeans in Africa. So let's move on to the independence movements and post-colonial period. Following World War II, many African nations embarked on the path to independence, with the majority achieving it by the 1970s. Post-colonial Africa has seen a wide range of experiences, with some countries experiencing relative stability and others suffering from conflict and instability. How did African countries gain independence? The decolonization of Africa was a complex process that took place over many years and varied greatly from one country to another. The Second World War greatly weakened European colonial powers. Many African soldiers fought for these colonial powers and were exposed to ideologies of freedom. Additionally, post-war, there was a widespread sentiment against colonialism worldwide. During the mid-20th century, many nationalist movements emerged throughout Africa. These movements were led by individuals educated either locally or in Europe, who drew on the concepts of democracy and self-determination to demand independence. The United Nations played a crucial role in decolonization. Its charter, adopted in 1945, was seen as supportive of the principle of self-determination. Over the years, it passed a series of resolutions condemning colonialism and supporting independence. The geopolitical dynamics of the Cold War period also contributed to the decolonization process. In some cases, colonies gained independence through peaceful negotiation. In other cases, violent conflict led to independence. Examples include the Algerian War of Independence from France and the armed struggles against Portuguese colonial rule in Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau. In 1960, British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan made a famous speech in which he acknowledged the wind of change sweeping through Africa. This led to the rapid decolonization of many British colonies. Much like the scramble for Africa, the exit was also hurried and disorganized. Some powers, like Britain, intended a more gradual transition but ended up leaving rapidly. By the 1980s, almost all African countries had gained independence. However, many faced significant challenges in the post-independence era, including political instability, economic changes, and social strife, legacies of the arbitrary borders, and divisive colonial policies. Which European country was most reluctant to let its African colonies become independent? Oh, it's Portugal! I did not expect that. Portugal was notably one of the most reluctant European powers to decolonize its African territories. This reluctance led to protracted independence struggles in the territories of Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, and Cape Verde. Portugal's government, under the authoritarian Estado Novo regime, considered their overseas territories to be an integral part of Portugal rather than separate colonies, and this led to their staunch resistance against decolonization. Unlike other European countries such as the United Kingdom and France, which began the decolonization process in the years following World War II, Portugal maintained its colonies well into the 1970s. It was largely due to the dictatorship of António de Oliveira Salazar, who ruled Portugal from 1932 until his incapacitation in 1968. Salazar insisted that Portugal's overseas territories were necessary for the nation's global prestige and economic well-being. As a result, the struggle for independence in Portuguese colonies was often violent and protracted, culminating in the so-called Carnation Revolution in Portugal in 1974, a military coup that toppled the Estado Novo regime and accelerated the decolonization process. This led to the swift independence of Angola and Mozambique in 1975, followed by the other colonies. In addition to Portugal, Belgium was also notably reluctant to grant independence to its colonies, most notably the Congo, leading to significant violence and instability when independence was abruptly granted in 1960. I want to know about the most economically and socially successful African country in the post-colonial era. What does ChatGPT have to tell us? Based on various indicators, Botswana often stands out as a success story in the post-colonial Africa. Botswana gained independence from Britain in 1966 and was one of the world's poorest countries. It has since transformed itself and become one of the world's fastest-growing economies, known for its political stability and relative lack of corruption. Botswana's economy has grown at an impressive rate since independence, largely due to its rich diamond resources. It has been able to utilize its diamond resources to fuel growth and development, avoiding the so-called resource curse that many other resource-rich countries experience. This success is often attributed to sound economic and fiscal policies, investment in human capital, and an open and transparent government. Botswana is also often considered one of Africa's most stable countries. It has a multi-party constitution and a tradition of lively and open debate. It has maintained a stable democratic government since its independence. Botswana also heavily invested in education. It recognizes that its diamond resources are finite and that the future lies in a well-educated workforce that can diversify the economy. Botswana consistently ranks as one of the least corrupt countries in Africa, according to Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index. It has taken impressive steps to combat HIV, providing free antiretroviral treatment to all citizens and running effective public health campaigns. However, it's important to note that all countries face challenges. In Botswana, for instance, there are still issues of economic inequality, high unemployment rate, especially among the youth, and the ongoing threat of HIV. No country is a perfect model, but Botswana's achievements make it an interesting case study in African development. I actually have no clue where Botswana is. Interesting, so it's right next to South Africa. Why is it interesting? It's interesting because they're very close to each other. Botswana and South Africa both are former British colonies and both are rich in diamonds. Nevertheless, in South Africa you had the infamous apartheid, which is going to be the next topic that we're going to discuss here. And Botswana, on the other side, has been doing really well. I want to figure out what's going on here. But first, let's discuss apartheid. Please tell me more about apartheid in South Africa, including a couple of interesting facts. Apartheid was a system of institutionalized racial segregation and discrimination in South Africa between 1948 and 1994. Wow, the year I was born. Under apartheid, the rights of the majority black inhabitants were curtailed, and white supremacy and Afrikaner minority rule were maintained. The term apartheid is an Afrikaans word that means separateness. The roots of apartheid stem from the colonial era. However, it was officially put into law after the National Party came to power in 1948. Apartheid was codified into law with legislation dividing people into racial groups: white, black, colored, and Indian. Indian? That's weird. And segregating all aspects of life, including education, healthcare, and land ownership. The African National Congress, led by figures such as Nelson Mandela, Oliver Tambo, and Walter Sisulu, was the primary opposition to apartheid. Initially advocating nonviolent resistance, the ANC later adopted a policy of armed resistance in response to state-led violence. The end of apartheid. No, I want to know more details. The Group Areas Act of 1950 strictly controlled where members of each racial group could live, with the best land reserved for whites. This resulted in forced removals of non-whites from their homes to segregated townships or rural homelands, often far from urban centers. This had a huge impact on family life and access to work. The past laws required black Africans to carry passes, essentially internal passports, when outside their homelands or designated areas. This severely restricted their freedom of movement and ability to find work. Many black South Africans were confined to low-paying jobs. Apartheid denied the right to vote to black South Africans and other non-white citizens, ensuring political power remained in the hands of the white minority. The Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act of 1949 and the Immorality Amendment Act of 1950 outlawed marriages and sexual relationships between white people and people of other races. Another example of the government trying to get into people's pants. Okay, this is very ugly, just as I expected though. The Bantu Education Act of 1953 enforced racial segregation in education and provided different syllabi for each race, creating huge disparities in education quality. It was designed to prepare black Africans for roles within the apartheid system, and as Hendrik Verwoerd, the architect of apartheid, said, to teach black Africans that equality is not for them. Wow, this is a strong contender. We have our parade of freaks on this episode. The first one was Cecil Rhodes, the second one was King Leopold II, and now we have Hendrik Verwoerd, or whatever the fuck his name is pronounced. Let's have a look at the man. There you go. This is our boy, played a significant role in socially engineering apartheid. How did he die? In 1966, Verwoerd was stabbed several times by parliamentary aide Dimitri Tsafendas. Is he Greek? Yes, he is. That's a hero. He died shortly after, and Tsafendas was jailed until his death in 1999. Well, that's sad. Back to the original question. Did Botswana have anything similar to apartheid? If not, why? Especially given the fact that both Botswana and South Africa are former British colonies and are close neighbors. Botswana, formerly the British Protectorate of Bechuanaland, did not have an apartheid system similar to that of South Africa. While both countries were under British control, their colonial experiences, timing of independence, and post-colonial leaderships differed significantly, leading to very different paths. Here are a few reasons why Botswana did not have a system like apartheid. The British governed their colonies in various ways, often depending on the economic value of the colony. South Africa was a valuable colony due to its gold and diamond reserves. It attracted significant white settlement and over time developed a strong identity separate from Britain. Conversely, Bechuanaland was a protectorate primarily intended to secure the route to the northern Rhodesia and was largely left to its own devices. I don't quite get it, but Botswana also had diamonds. Unlike South Africa, Botswana did not have a significant white population. The lack of demographic pressure minimized the establishment of a racialized political and social system. Okay. There you go. After independence, Botswana discovered significant diamond reserves. With effective management and good governance, this wealth helped Botswana to develop without needing to rely on a system of racial oppression. As if South Africa needed apartheid to develop. Also, despite pressures from apartheid South Africa and the racial politics of Rhodesia, Botswana maintained a policy of political neutrality and non-interference, which allowed it to navigate the region's politics without implementing similar systems. I think this is also weird. Like how having something similar to apartheid would help Botswana to navigate the region's politics. Anyways, it's still very educational. In a nutshell, Botswana did so well because prior to its independence, nobody knew that it had diamonds, so none of the white folks wanted to stay there. Everything that I've read about Europeans in Africa is just so fucked up. To summarize, we have spent quite some time going through the history of Africa. It was, of course, a very superficial research, but compared to the total lack of information about African history that I had, now I'm a fucking expert. It's actually interesting because I almost forgot what brought me here in the first place, and it was the article by Olufemi Taiwo that said that pre-colonial Africa never existed. And now this kind of makes much more sense, because one of the biggest discoveries that I made here was that colonial period lasted for at most 100 years. What else did I learn? I learned that the Belgians suck, that Hegel was a racist, although this is not much of a surprise to me, and that I really want to visit Botswana in the nearest future. This has been a very interesting journey. It took me ages to finally make this episode. I think that I've had like 15 recording sessions and a lot of things went wrong, but I'm definitely going to continue this series. So see you in the future episodes. Press like, subscribe to my channel, and leave comments, especially if I said something stupid here, which I most certainly did.